During his Senate years, he played a leadership role in major environmental and conservation legislation, military reform initiatives, initiatives to advance the information revolution. We're talking, this is back prior to '87, and new directions in foreign policy. He was co-chair of the U.S. Commission on National Security for the 21st Century, just before the turn of the century. He earned graduate law and divinity degrees from Yale and a PhD from Oxford. He's written 20 books, including 4 novels. And tonight we're going to focus, as Ted said, on his newest book, The Republic of Conscience.
It's actually 21 books. I wrote another one last night.
On the plane.
On the plane.
So, though I've interviewed you a few times on the radio over the years, as I mentioned to you upstairs, we first met briefly in 1972. I ran an assembly district in the eastern section of LA County for McGovern, and Senator Hart was the campaign manager. Could you talk just a bit about that experience and how it may have influenced and contributed to your path going forward?
First of all, you and I were both children at that time. It was only, how many years ago? 28, 40 some years ago. I was a very young lawyer. I had, up to then, been involved in only 2 presidential campaigns, handing out leaflets as a student on the street corners for John Kennedy, and then working as a volunteer in Robert Kennedy's '68 campaign. And like many others of my generation, we were looking for a candidate who both stood against the war in Vietnam or for ending the war in Vietnam, but also addressing the civil rights and other revolutions going on in the turbulent '60s and early '70s, aspiration of women for equality, the environmental movement, all that was going on in those days. The brief answer to your question is 12 years later, when I was a candidate for national office myself, the experience that I had in starting virtually from zero with Senator McGovern and building a grassroots organization over 50 states proved invaluable in knowing what to expect in a very low budget campaign of my own.
Since you mentioned low budget, I had meant to ask this. We're going to talk about the influence of money in the current situation. What were your budgets when you were running for the Senate in Colorado?
It would be hard for people in the audience to believe, but in the 1974 Senate race, the first race I ever made for office myself, there were 6 Democrats seeking the nomination to run against a wealthy 2-term incumbent Republican, and the entire campaign cost $375,000. 6 years later, for the re-election campaign in 1980, it had climbed to about 3 times that, about $1 million, and I was outspent. Last year in Colorado, a state of 5 million people, not nearly as big as this state, the Senate race involved spending on the record by each of the candidates $25 million, and that does not include the money spent by the super PACs. So I know people in California are very used to big numbers, but for those of us in a modest-sized state, it's just in that period of time, astronomical increase in the cost.
Yeah, yeah. Given what we've just said and what people know about you, some may be surprised that I've heard you say that about 25 years ago, you became a Republican.
I did.
Can you talk about that?
In case there are any fellow Democrats out there, don't get up and leave. The question has to do with the purpose of the book and why it was written. I've read Thomas Jefferson all my life, and began to be interested after leaving office in learning more about what our founders had intended for this country. And when you read the correspondence, voluminous correspondence, and that they had with each other, and the debates in the Constitutional Convention. Over and over again, you run into the language of the Republic. And these were almost all men, given the times, but they were almost all educated in the classics. And they not only read the early Greek and Roman political philosophers, starting, of course, with Plato and Aristotle and moving on to the Romans, but they read them in the original Greek and Latin. And when they were to agree on the form of government that they were creating, they harked back to those earliest days, and it was the ideal of the Republic that was created in Athens, 5th, 4th century BC. So when asked to describe his political philosophy, Jefferson described himself as a democratic Republican. And that phrase kind of stuck in my mind, so I set out rather late in life to study the history and ideal of the Republic and why our founders chose that form of government. And we can discuss the principles behind that as time goes on.
Yeah, I want to circle back again to a little bit of biography. One of the things that you point out that the founders felt was going to be a necessity, and that you see is on the wane or lacking now, is civic religion, civic spirit. Can you talk about when that first awakened in you?
Well, it was the campaign of John Kennedy. Now, one of the curiosities of the famous "Ask Not" quotation was whether then Senator, then President Kennedy understood that that was purely from the earliest Athenian Republic, because central to the ideal of the Republic was what the early philosophers and our founders called civic virtue. They believed that a republic of the sort they were creating would not survive without that sense of citizen obligation, participation, whatever you want to call it today. They believed that that form of government they were creating would perish or languish, as other republics in the past have, if citizens gave up being involved, if not on a daily basis, on a regular basis. And being involved for them was much more than just voting, and even paying what today are considered the loathsome taxes we are asked to pay for this civilized society. But much more participating, frankly, in forums such as this, and not just listening to people like me babble on, but expressing the citizens' point of view so that their elected leaders and officials would know what was on the public mind.
And you mentioned that you went back and studied some of this. You actually, I mentioned 3 degrees. You went back to Oxford in your 60s?
Years and years ago.
But,
yes.
But a little bit about that.
I was a young man then.
What prompted you to do it? What did you study? What was that experience like?
Well, I've always believed in, if not formal, at least informal, lifelong learning. And I think the older modern medicine has permitted us to live gives us a chance beyond retirement or even before retirement to learn, to go back to school, to take classes. And increasingly, I think older generations, senior citizens like myself, are taking advantage of that, which is a great thing so long as old folks don't crowd young folks out for necessary seats in universities and colleges. But it was also an intellectual challenge. I'd started out to be an academic, and my years before going to law school were ultimately designed to prepare to teach in college, get a doctorate or qualified to teach. And that was interrupted by law school and then government and politics and so forth. So this was a full circle for me to go back to school and finish what I had started 30 or 40 years before. And frankly, I had done all the research on the Jeffersonian ideal of the Republic, and that's what I wanted to write about.
Very good. I'm going to mentioning Jefferson. Your blog site is called mattersofprinciple.org, and it features right at the top a quote from Jefferson: "In matters of style, swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock." Could you speak a bit about why this is important to you at this moment?
Most of the public debate between the parties, to the degree there is any debate any longer, or discussion, has to do with policy, and policy addresses the issues of the day. For example, the issues of the second decade of the 21st century are vastly different from even the issues that we confronted in the 1990s. And in that respect, one hopes that candidates for president will tailor their remarks to the realities of 21st century America and not just talk about what they did in the past or the past they want to go back to. Jefferson also said that if you try to apply the policies of the past to the changing world, it would be as if a man tried to wear the coat that he wore as a boy, meaning times change and policies must change. But what he also said, and others like him said, principles shouldn't change. And what this book seeks to deal with are the principles upon which the nation was founded, and how in the 230 years since that founding, and more particularly in the 20 or 30 years just preceding today, this country has abandoned those principles.
And what were those principles?
We've mentioned one, the civic virtue,
right,
or citizen participation. But the first principle was popular sovereignty. Now, to us, that's kind of an abstraction. In this state, back in the 60s, the Black Panthers put it differently: power to the people. But that's what popular sovereignty is. And if you go back in human history, it's a profound insight, because almost all of human history has been dominated by kings and oligarchs and dictators and so forth, and to a degree still is. So for our founders, more than 2 centuries ago, to say the power of this country resides with all of us, not with an oligarchy in Washington, is a profound observation. So popular sovereignty, civic virtue, or citizen participation. The third principle was a sense of the commonwealth. As you know, many of our original colonies called themselves commonwealths. Commonwealth of Virginia, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We've kind of lost sight of what that means. It means all the things that we as citizens of America own together. And there has been, and continues to be, a constant struggle by elements of our society, particularly on the conservative side, to privatize all those things that we hold in common. And those of us in the West, particularly my part of the West, where the public lands are and the public resources on and under those lands, timber and minerals and so forth, and the recreational resources in and on the public lands, is just the beginning. Our water systems, our environment, our air and our water, our transportation systems, the airwaves that we license to broadcasters so that they can make money, those airwaves belong to us. There is still this kind of demented insistence on taking that away from us and future generations and turning it over to immediate exploitation and profit. Finally, and this is the principle that is most trenchant, I think, is resistance to corruption. Now, if we went outside on Olympic Boulevard this evening and stopped 10 people and asked, how do you define corruption? They'd say bribery or money under the table, quid pro quo. That's not what our founders meant by corruption. Their definition of corruption was placing special, narrow, or personal interests ahead of the common good. Now take that principle and apply it to present-day Washington, and you have to conclude that our government is massively corrupt. There are over 13,000 registered lobbyists today in Washington. 30 years ago, there were 162. Lobbying is a $4 to $5 billion annual industry in Washington, and members of Congress are routinely now, up to half of them, walking out the door and with a short delay of 12 months or 24 months, becoming lobbyists, trading their titles that were given to them by the voters of their states and districts for money. That's corruption.
Now, interestingly, one of the, I think we all probably agree, one of the real stakes in the ground in this path to corruption was Citizens United. And what's interesting to me, as I was reading your book, was remembering that decision rests on an interpretation of corruption. And the interpretation of corruption is the small one, is quid pro quo. You're saying that the founders, on whom so many of these Supreme Court justices say they pledge allegiance, had a completely different one. Could you speak to that?
Special interests being placed ahead of the common good. Well, I don't, it's clearly an overstatement to say it, but I think any C student in any law school in America would find it difficult to believe that those who drafted the Constitution would give the same right of free speech in the First Amendment to a legal fiction called a corporation. Corporations have not existed forever. They were created by law, and they are to do two things: to protect shareholders from lawsuits in case whatever they're producing goes bad, but also to make money. So for 5 Supreme Court justices to say that the founders of this country intended in the First Amendment to give those corporations the legal fiction that they are, the same rights of free speech that they intended for each of us, is just pure folly. And it will be reversed.
How?
Changing the Supreme Court.
So you think actually a new Supreme Court at some point will reverse that decision?
I think 2 more Supreme Court justices will do it.
Okay. Okay.
By the way, that's not novel. We had Dred Scott. We've had decisions all throughout our history where the Supreme Court has said you can own slaves, and too long thereafter, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't. So this will happen. I hope I live long enough.
Would you, since it's so much the core of not only the book, but your urge to write the book, I think, is this sense of corruption, this sense of those 4 principles being violated. Civic participation is down, this sense of special interest over common good is up, commonwealth. I mean, it's so interesting when you were saying that about privatization, I was thinking, yes, they say, don't let government have that. Give it to us, when in fact privatization is give it to someone who will make money.
Private, corporate, and profit-making interests. We are the Commonwealth. We own those things. They belong to us. They don't belong to the government. The government administers the public's resources on our behalf. Now, if they don't do it well, change the government. But don't privatize what belongs to all of us and our children.
So what I was going to say is, would you like, before I launch into some other questions, just to flesh out a little more in any way the situation that leads you to write this book and call us to a republic of conscience?
Two things, and I think I've discussed them both already. One is how much all this tide has happened in the 30 years since I've left office, and how much it departs from what our founders intended for us. I think everybody here knows, and people outside this auditorium know, there is great unhappiness, discontent, anger at Washington. And indeed, almost everybody who runs for office now, for national office, starts by saying, I hate what's going on in Washington and I want to get there and change it. Well, no, they don't. They get there and they want to stay there. It's either not as bad as they told everybody it was, or they become part of the problem. So I think starting with the arrival of a man named Murdoch here in 1985, and the rise of partisan media, and the constant drumbeat that, starting with a presidential inaugural in 1980, that the government is the problem. If you beat that drum long enough, people are sooner or later going to believe it. But the problem is that the principles upon which we were founded are all intertwined. If people are distrustful of government, and there's clear distrust of government these days, it's not just because it's inefficient and polarized. It's that people realize it's a network of insiders, a revolving door where people come into office, leave office, stay in Washington, become lobbyists, go back into administrations, and it's all the same people, and the same Rolodexes, and basically the same policies. But as we started out discussing, time doesn't stand still. I am amazed. In some ways, I am very conservative, or I wouldn't be here talking about founders that lived 230 years ago. I want to conserve what it was they stood for. But for people to think they can freeze, this is again the difference between principle and policy, freeze policy or take it back, privatize Social Security, that lingers in the minds of very conservative people. It's a hatred of government, a dislike of government, and that poisons citizen involvement in government.
Very good. I just want to, one of the studies that came out last year from Martin Gillen of Princeton,
Yes.
and Benjamin Page of Northwestern, where they took this thing that everyone says, well, the elites have all the power and so on, and they did the math. And it really said that when you look at, they looked at 1,800 decisions, but over the course of, I think, about 15 years, and they found that basically the only time what the majority, what 80% of the public wanted passed, was when it agreed with what the oligarchs wanted. I mean, it's striking. So you indict the media, you indict you indict the system of lobbying. You point out, I've heard you point out that the statesmen, senators that were in your era, none of them became lobbyists.
No. I think I was told by an historian recently that there were fewer than 2% of members of Congress in the 1970s who became lobbyists, and none of the great senators that I served with. I can't see the audience. I think there are people out there, but I doubt any of you are of my age. But if you were, I would mention the names of those senators, Mike Mansfield, and the list goes on both sides of the aisle. It wasn't partisan. They wouldn't even come back to the Senate after they retired for fear that people would think they were lobbying their former colleagues. So they would just stay away. And I watched them and learned from them. And in my own case, having seen what happened, having watched what began to happen in the 80s and is going full bore now, I refuse to lobby, and I've never made 10 cents lobbying, and I never will, because I just don't believe it's right.
So, it's pretty obvious to me and many others that one of our major political parties basically runs as anti-government. I think Republicans assume and abet failure and stokes the cynicism that leads to the lack of civic participation. What role does the Democratic Party play in the failures that you're talking about?
Well, to the lobbyists, to keep harping on the lobbyists, there, as I think almost all of you know, there used to be in the early days Democratic lobbying firms and Republican lobbying firms, and then they got smart and they teamed up so that whichever party was in power, either in the House or Senate or White House, you were covered. Your clients were covered. Your corporate interests were covered. And if you just look at the list of the top lobbying firms in America, you will find equal number of Democrats and Republicans in them. Again, too often former office holders. So I don't think you can, this system of corruption is right across the board. It's not right or left. It is part of this closed network that just simply revolves and perpetuates itself. And by the way, the net effect of that is not only to create citizen distrust of government, because it's all insiders, but it shuts out talented, thoughtful people who might want to run for office or serve on a committee staff, young people who have other ambitions than just being on the White House staff, but really do idealistically want to serve their country and make it better. They look at this and they say, how in the world can I possibly participate in a closed system like that? And it is very deleterious. The other aspect of this is the monumental explosion of campaign finance. And that is all part of this network because the money for the campaigns is often raised by the lobbyists who take advantage of having access to the candidate they supported. So you had this twin escalation. It really did occur in the last 2 or 3 decades, 3 decades, about the time I left office, of an explosion of lobbying, an explosion of campaign funds, and the joining of them, and the limiting of people who can run for office. Now, if you say that today, people say, yeah, but there's 16 or 18 people running on the Republican side. But what the press has revealed is that a number of those have their own billionaire sponsors. And I say only half in jest in the book that the time may come where those sponsors will require their logos on the suits of the senators and the candidates that they support. So a dark horse candidate for the presidency announces for president and said, by the way, this casino billionaire is my sponsor. And they hold their own primaries. The Koch brothers hold a primary. Everybody troops out there and performs for them. So they decide which one they will support or ones. And other billionaires do the same. So it's not just collected, bundled money. It is single interest big money.
I do want to talk a little bit about where we go from here, but before I do, the book also deals not just with domestic policy, not just with Washington, but with foreign policy, about which you've had a great deal of experience, and privacy, the NSA, surveillance. How do those two fields fit into what you're talking about?
Well, it seems, to put it like that the book is a hodgepodge. I have 2 sections in there which you mentioned. One is called a manifesto for domestic policy, a manifesto for foreign policy. And that was not to lay out a Hart agenda at home and abroad. It was to demonstrate how you might go about
constructing domestic and foreign policy based on principle. So it isn't one man arguing for his own domestic and foreign policy. It was saying, because there are so many pragmatists, if you will, in Washington, or realists who say, please don't talk principle. We're in a mean, tough world, and that's great for 8th grade civics, but it doesn't work in real life. Well, I try to lay out how it would work, how it could work, and we would regain our moral authority in the world in the process. But the historic, to try to find out, to answer the why question, how did this all happen and why? I date the beginning of the change in America in a lot of ways to 1947 and the passage of the National Security Act, which not only created the CIA and the Air Force and the Permanent Defense Department and a National Security Council, but really laid the statutory framework for what came to be called the national security state, and how so much of both domestic and foreign policy was built around that Cold War base that was laid in 47 and persists today, 20 years after the end of the Cold War. But together with that came the intelligence state. I mentioned the CIA. It's not the CIA anymore. It's 16 or 18 intelligence services, and beyond that, in the last decade or two, the adding of consultants. Welcome, Mr. Snowden. So people think Mr. Snowden's a hero. Mr. Snowden didn't work for the CIA directly or the NSA. He was a consultant. He worked for a contractor. So you not only have the agencies on the federal budget in this growing complex, but then what happened with the Defense Department, all the private contractors built around it. And then what I call the expeditionary state, leaving 800 military bases 60, 70 years after the end of World War II, 160 some military bases in Germany alone. Why? What is that about? So that leads to the idea that we need to intervene in every squabble in the world, and that in turn feeds into all the rest of the changes that have occurred in this country since the end of World War II.
You know, I just want to read one quote. Expedience is never a justification for unconstitutional and immoral actions. This is so even where self-defense and national security are concerned. Again, back to principles.
Indeed, and that deep feeling on my part sprung from an assignment I got in the first 3 months I was in the Senate in 1975, called the Church Committee. And the Church Committee, now 40 years old, uncovered this wilderness of mirrors that was going on without congressional oversight, despite the constitutional requirement that all activities of the executive branch be overseen by the elected branch. And Congress had just simply not done its duty between 1947 and 1975. And that committee led to oversight committees in the Senate and the House, and reforms. Gerald Ford signed a presidential order ending attempted assassinations against foreign leaders. Guess what? We're back in the business with drones.
Yep.
On the basis of expediency. Easier to kill people from up there than send in the troops. Well, question, if we're killing people, are we killing the right ones? We tried for years to kill Fidel Castro. Bizarre. Good thing for him, we didn't have drones at that time.
That's right. No, I mean, it's interesting that George Bush initiates and Cheney initiate preemptive war as a principle, but Obama has followed with preemptive assassinations. It's the same, the same principle, if you will.
Well, that's what expediency is
exactly.
about.
Again, to call on your foreign policy experience, what are your thoughts on the nuclear agreement with Iran?
I'm for it.
Any?
No.
Well, no, I didn't mean you have any hesitations. Do you want to expand on that? Because one thing that I have read was how you said anyone who says we negotiated. You have a great statement in one of your blogs about negotiation.
Well, just the fact that we don't negotiate with our friends.
Right, you don't have to.
We don't have an arms control agreement with the British. So people say, why are you negotiating with Iran? Because that's how you manage your adversaries. And you either got three choices. Leave them alone, don't do anything, go to war, or negotiate. If anybody can come up with a fourth alternative, I'd love to know what it is. And in this case, like all of the arms control agreements we negotiated under both political parties over 40 years with the Soviets and the Russians, adversaries, not friends, it was in our national security interest to do so. We weren't doing the Russians a favor, and we're not doing the Iranians a favor. And by the way, finally, this isn't a negotiation between the United States and Iran. It was a negotiation conducted by the United States Secretary of State, brilliantly, I believe, on behalf not only of us, but the Security Council of the United Nations.
Finally, the question that I always have to ask. I've read and interviewed a lot of authors who go over this turf. Winner-take-all politics, Hacker and Pearson. Who Stole the American Dream, Hedrick Smith. The Betrayal of the American Dream, Bartlett and Steele. The momentum in the system seems headed in the wrong direction. And you write, quote, "There will be a popular revolt against the corruption of American government." How do you see that happening?
Why I see it happening is because I'm a student of Arthur Schlesinger's theory of cycles of American history. And he used what I think were euphemisms to avoid other words. He talked about cycles of consolidation, which basically meant less government, more conservative economic policies, and then a cycle of reform when that laissez-faire period ended in corruption. And so then there was a reform period. All of you know the Teapot Dome scandal, real corruption in the bribery sense. By the way, if people think I use harsh rhetoric in this book, I would urge you to look up a comment Tom Friedman made, probably the top columnist in the country these days, on Morning Joe last week. When asked how he would describe what's going on in Washington, he said it is legal bribery. I don't use that word. That was Tom Friedman. The Economist magazine, a conservative British, they call it newspaper, pro-capitalist, limited government, editorialized three weeks ago that lobbying in Washington was not only corrupting American government, it was corrupting American capitalism. So others have made similar points. To get around the notion, I don't want to leave the notion this is a negative book. The last line of this book is, how do I know I'm an idealist? Because I am an American. I believe in this country. I believe the people of this country will not put up with this situation much longer. They'll figure out a way.
Questions?
Fascinating to listen to your talk. I have a nephew that's at Yale Law School right now. I know you went to Yale Law School. And what would you advise he do? He's interested in politics and wants to do something with his degree and have an influence on the world. What would you suggest he do at this point?
It's going boom, boom.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
He says he has a nephew?
Yes.
nephew, Yale Law School, wants to go into politics, wants to make a difference, what would you advise him?
Do it. No, it may be the young people of this country that rescue us. My generation is too far down the track, I think. A little creaky and deaf to be conducting revolutions. So I would have the nephew do what I did 25 years ago and go back and start reading early American history, particularly the dean of early American history, Gordon Wood, who taught at Brown for 40 years and has written profound books on the radicalism of the American Revolution, and it was radical, and have young people recapture the sense of idealism that John Kennedy awakened in my generation. And by the way, I mentioned that one of my law school classmates in that law school was Jerry Brown. And I didn't hear run for office. I heard do something for the country. And of course that involved the new Peace Corps, all kinds of civic involvement. So there are congressional staffs whereby you can learn an awful lot about a particular topic or field of study by working on one of those staffs if this individual can get one of those assignments. It's a wonderful experience for 2 or 3 or 4 years or even more. You learn not only what's wrong with government, but also down deep how profoundly stable it is and how the government that was laid down 230 years ago is going to survive this assault on its integrity. And all I can say, I don't want to name names, but I will. I think Bill Clinton and Barack Obama have missed an opportunity to renew that sense of idealism with young people. And I'm not quite clear why neither one of them has done that.
Okay, I have 2 questions. One, I have some skeptical friends. So if I say things have definitely gotten worse in the last 30 years, they might say, well, money's always dominated everything. There's a tendency to kind of make the past rosier than it was. And now, it's probably kind of marginally more of the same, but we have, Fox News and Twitter. And then also second, if you were a senator today, how would you spend most of your time? Would you try to just spend it talking to other senators, finding consensus on something? Would you try to raise money outside of government for charities you supported? Would you just do the media circuit and try to publicize issues? Just what would you do as a senator today to try to improve the situation?
So I will.
Let me explain. Increased age erodes hearing. So what my translator here is...
Right. First thing he said is that he can imagine skeptic friends of his who would say, he says, Gary Hart says it's gotten worse in the last 30 years. And they'll say, oh, it's always been bad. Everybody, especially the old folks, like to say it was better back then. So that was just sort of your premise, right? And then he said, if you were in the Senate today, he actually said, how would you spend most of your time? And I know the answer to that. That's the answer, fundraising. But he said, what would you do? How would you navigate in this current situation?
It's a very good question. I did say to myself when I went into office at a fairly young age that I was not going to fall prey to the old-timer statement that it was better back then. But I find myself doing it all the time. But it is by comparison. I mentioned Mike Mansfield. Mike Mansfield was a senator from Montana, majority leader when I went there. I was in my 30s, and here I found myself never having held office, in the Senate with people like him and really great giants. And I watched them and I listened to them and learned from them about how to be a senator, what it meant to be a senator. So it was better then. We did solve problems. I know it's hard for young people to believe it or not, but Democrats talk to Republicans. More importantly, Republicans talk to Democrats. I know that you'll find that very hard to believe, but it happened. So it can happen, and it was better. And I think anyone who's lived through that era and this era would agree with me. So I am going to be an old codger and say it was better back then.
But to his second question.
Yeah, but I will tell you that I can't tell you how many senators with 6-year terms have told me that routinely starting in their first year in office, they go across the street to the Republican or Democratic campaign headquarters, national headquarters, and make phone calls for 2 hours a day raising money. That's in year 1. And that happens for 6 straight years. I couldn't be elected today because I won't do that. So I wouldn't do that. It's a dereliction of duty. You're not being a senator if you're spending 2 hours a day raising money. You just aren't. And spending time with the lobbyists who will help you raise money if you go along with what they want or at least listen to them. I'll tell you again, the old codger story. The first time I believe things were getting off the track, a group of Coloradans came in. I think it was '79, and I was facing re-election the coming year, and I hadn't even begun to raise money. And we had a discussion about whatever their concern was. I wish I had written it down. I guess it doesn't matter, but it seemed to me at the time to be a legitimate issue of rural electrification or something of that sort, a concern that they had. And the Washington representative of their national organization brought them in and took them out. And on the way out, that individual stopped by my administrative assistant's desk and left an envelope. So the administrative assistant came in, handed me the envelope, plain white envelope. So I opened it up, and here's a check for $2,000, Hart Re-Election Committee. So I gave it back to him and said, run down the hall and give that back to them. I do not want anybody in Colorado to think they have to pay to come see me. And then it dawned on me that this must be the beginning of a system. That was the day.
You know, excuse me, but you triggered a question in me, which is that you talk about the statesmen, that our founders were statesmen, these senators that you came in under were statesmen, and, you know, where are statesmen today? And I remember when Obama made his speech that made him famous, that, you know, we're not blue, we're not red, we're Americans, his inauguration speech, even his campaign, optimism, he went in. I think he aspired to live that way, to govern that way. Any thoughts? I mean,
well, but he also, when he said that, or some of his early campaign speeches at least, the economy had not fallen into the toilet. He did not know he knew about 3 months before he took office, or before the election, what was transpiring, and it wasn't good.
But that's, in some sense, a crisis should make us come together more.
It should. And by the way, there were the bailouts. Awful lot of conservatives were outraged by them. Others voted for them because it was Wall Street, and there were enough serious people that said, if we don't do this, it's going to set off a worldwide depression. So I think he gets credit for saving the economy, but it wasn't the economy he thought he was going to inherit.
Yeah.
Picture 5 years from now. It's the year 2020, and suddenly everybody is struck with great clarity. It's coast to coast. We all have 20/20 vision and see what's going on. And we're reeling against the Democrats and the Republicans and have decided to have a new constitutional convention. What would be your 3 top revisions for an updated constitution?
Okay. What he said was, imagine 5 years from now,
You know what I'm gonna do?
2020.
I'm going to go down. I've got a microphone. I'm going to go down there so I can hear people.
Without it bouncing as much? No.
Yeah.
He said, imagine 5 years from now, clarity has struck people, and they see that the system is corrupt, both parties and so on, and they opt for a new constitutional convention. What would be your 3 things you might do to revise or update the Constitution?
Yeah, well, it's not going to happen, but so let's speculate. In no particular order, I think if I didn't, somebody else would introduce a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. A second item for such a convention, and we haven't talked about this, but we should, is to depoliticize the drawing of congressional boundaries, to take them out of the hands of political state legislatures. The dividing of this country into red and blue has also occurred, not accidentally, while the lobbying industry exploded and campaign finances exploded. So you all know that of the 435 seats in the House elected every year, only some 30 or 40 are contested. By that, I mean have a genuine competition between a Democrat and a Republican. The rest are drawn, the rest of the districts are drawn so that whoever wins his or her party's nomination virtually automatically wins the seat. So that has driven, I think, more on the right than on the left, people to extremes with the rise of the Tea Party and so forth. And so you have members of Congress coming in and taking over the majority in the House who are pledged to carry out the agenda of the Tea Party, which is virtually totally against government. This is tying Republicans into knots, like on the XM Bank, for example. Wall Street Republicans want the XM Bank. Corporate Republicans want the XM Bank. Tea Party Republicans don't. And they're about to kill each other over it, I gather. Well, this is what happens when a party tries to placate one wing of that party. You know, people will say, oh, back in the Roosevelt era, the Democrats did it with the labor unions. Well, I don't think it's even comparable. Clearly, labor unions had a lot more power back in the day, or thereafter, after the Roosevelt era. But we also got Social Security and Medicare and workplace safety and a lot of other advances out of that. So I'm not here to give a political speech, but we got. I think if we're going to get a purple America, and by the way, I'm in one of the last 5 or 6 purple states in Colorado. We're going to have to take drawing every 10 years the drawing of congressional district lines away from politicians.
We've done that in California, you know.
I know.
Yeah. So those were 2. Did you have a third?
Oh, there are 5 more.
When you were a senator in Colorado, tell us about the agenda with the environment and working with the Udall family.
Oh, I've known the Udall, if the question is about the Udall family, I worked for Stuart Udall as Secretary of the Interior for 2 years in Washington in his office, and I served with Mo Udall, Mark's father, I think almost all the 12 years I was in the Congress, knew him very, very well. And am a very, very close friend of Mark Udall. So people hyperbolically have called the Udall family the Kennedys of the West. And they have, Mark's cousin is a senator from New Mexico, Stewart's son, I think. And they've just, as a family, they've just made an incredible contribution to the country at large, but particularly to the environment, to conservation. I was in the Interior Department in the 60s when a tipping point occurred between what used to be, in the post-Teddy Roosevelt era, the preservation-conservation movement that created a lot of the beauty, or protected a lot of the beauty in this state and elsewhere, John Muir and others. But when we suddenly began to realize there was a cost of the industrial age and the dawn of the environmental movement, and it was like being there at the creation of a massive shift from conservation and preservation to cleaning up the damage that had been done. And we're still doing that, and we will continue to do that now that we're faced with climate catastrophe.